Hey, everybody. I'm Jeffrey. This is Plain Spoken. I interview people on Plain Spoken all the time. I enjoy it a lot because, believe it or not, I get sick of my own voice. I hear it all the time and I need to talk to other people. And one of the people that listens to my voice a lot, he might already be sick of it, is Stephen Bachmeier. He's a missionary in Japan. I was talking with him before I turned on the camera. I'll show you what this is in a minute. But this is where he is. He's in Yamaguchi Prefecture in Shunan. It's a coastal city. And I'm going to zoom out where you can see where he is. Oh my gosh, look at how big this nation actually is. I've heard that Japan is roughly the same size as California. So I think that's the majority of Japan right there. So he's in that tiny little, well, it looks tiny to us. It's probably much bigger than Nowata, where I'm at. But he's been a part of live streams that I've done for a long time. He's been an excellent commenter. He's theologically grounded. I personally have an appreciation for Japan. I've never been there, but my brother and I have followed some big stories. By stories, I don't mean news stories. I mean like Naruto and Boruto, Attack on Titan. Some of the best stories being told today are by Japanese storytellers in the field of manga. And you can roll your eyes at that if you want, but I actually think it's a part of knowing, especially how to minister to young men. So many young men follow these narratives in America, not just white guys, but black young men. There's a lot of cultural overlap in our culture right now, and I don't think you need to know about all the sinful things that people do in order to minister to them. But I think it is good to know the stories that are being told to make sense out of life. So that might sound like so much of an excuse to talk to Stephen, and maybe it kind of is. I've just wanted to talk to Stephen, and I've thought it would be good for me to know about ministry in Japan. As I forget who initially said it, but about the Japanese, they're just like any other people, but more so. And I think that was true in a certain way 100 years ago, as things were priming up for World War II. But I think it's true in a certain way today, where we can get out ahead of some things, particularly around technology and AI and what spirituality looks like there. I don't know how much of that we're going to get into that with me and Stephen today. I just know that's where my head goes whenever I think about ministry in Japan. My head also goes to Scorsese did a movie several years ago about Roman Catholic missionary men going over there, and just what a struggle it was to bring any form of Christianity to the Japanese people. And so, these are things bouncing around in my head as I'm just talking to another guy with a similar cultural background to me. And I've talked enough about him. Y'all, this is Stephen right here. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on my show. And what time is it for you over there? You already told me, but tell the audience.
It is 1:39 a.m.
So he is greatly honoring you, my friends, by waking up this early to visit with you. And of course, that was what the other thing was that I was presenting to you. This is the place that you can go to support him and his mission work. And we are going to talk about his mission work here. Hopefully, if you agree with him that this is a worthy mission field, then that's where you can go to support his ministry. And I'll show you that and point you to the link at the tail end of this. But for right now, Stephen, how about you just tell us a bit about you and your background and why you chose to go to Japan?
Oh man, so I always tell everyone it's a long story going from Texas to South Carolina to Japan. Came to faith when I was 18 in college, and it really came down to seeing people love the Lord with all their heart, mind, body, and soul, and exemplify that through loving others as well. Came back down to the Wesley Foundation at West Texas A&M, and it will always be a impactful time for me there, where I got to see exactly that, but also got to meet some foreigners that were not Christian, and having many discussions with friends at the time about what does it mean to love your neighbor. And it led to all deciding to become a missionary. And I attended an international interdenominational school in Columbia, South Carolina called Columbia International University. And I wanted to attend it because I wanted to challenge my faith background of Methodism, just to see what else was out there. And I truly do believe that if your entire theology revolves around one man, then you probably need to check yourself and just see, hey, maybe he's not 100% right because he is only human. And I think that's a great reminder for all of us. But from there, I did an internship in Kazakhstan and I just continued to feel that call. I wanted to go back to Central Asia, but the Lord kept closing those bridges. And every time I talked to people about Central Asia or Japan, everyone would ask about, well, what do you know about Japan? Or why Japan? Nothing about Central Asia. It just escaped everyone's mind. And so I started questioning. I was like, Lord, am I being selfish with wanting to go back there? And when I accepted that I had been, when I decided, yeah, I think you're telling me I'm being selfish,
Mm,
everything started to change. And I really started to grow a heart for the Japanese people and really understand how difficult it is here to not just be a Christian, but just to be a human in Japan.
mm.
It's a place that I want to be careful how I say it because I don't want to over dramatize it, but I feel like it's the most accurate way for me to say it is where the culture has gaslit the people into thinking that they are okay as is. And it's far from the truth. So welcome
Things
to
that I think
Japan.
I know about Japan. And my how much the audience shares in this, I don't know, but I think most people are aware that population collapse is a real issue, not just in South Korea. I think it's worse in South Korea, but in Japan, it's really bad. I've seen a couple things about how dating is just not happening, and that I get the impression that young men in particular are just really hooked on video games, computers, gadgets. Um, but meanwhile, this is the thing that's hard for me because it's one thing if people are so alienated from themselves that they don't even like have any testosterone and they don't know what passion is. But then when you look at the stories they're producing, it's full of passion, full of aggression and heartache and heartbreak. And so it's weird to me, and it doesn't feel like we're that dissimilar, but it does feel like to be a Japanese person, you must have this very rich inner life that is alienated from your outer life. And then when you say that they're gaslit, so my impression of the Japanese historically is informed mostly by hardcore history. I'm forgetting his name right now, but the
Dan
portrait.
Carlin.
Thank you, Dan Carlin. He paints a portrait of a culture that did nationalism just about better than anybody else in the early 20th century. Just everybody sublimated
Absolutely.
themselves to the nation state, personified by the emperor, but also, just with. I mean, this is where kamikaze pilots were common. This is where everybody plugged in and had a place. And we had a version of that in America. And God knows the Germans and the Third Reich did it. I mean, that was just the time to do it. But the Japanese did it so well that they invaded the mainland and were able to enslave almost all of Eastern China. And they were capable of great and mighty things. And then they did that in the economic sector in the 1980s with Zaibatsus and Keiretsus and all this organized tech. And it seems like they've stayed mostly on top of that. My understanding is that militarily they're ascending, especially with their navy, and they're finally kind of pushing back against some of the constraints we put on them after World War II. But even so, it feels to me as an outsider looking at them like they're a culture in decline. Um, so as I say all that about Japan, how much of that sticks, and then how much do you think Western eyes might miss about the people you've chosen to love?
I think it's very interesting. I think you hit the nail on the head, but at the same time, it's still much deeper than that. Like I'm in the 1980s, in the late 80s, you do have the economic collapse that took place where the economy still has not recovered from that collapse in 1990 or no, 1988, I believe is when it started. So you have a whole generation after that that never got into the white collar jobs because of their culture of what they do after college and how they get those jobs, where it's just large job fairs and you're hired there. If you're not hired there, you might as well start looking for a part-time job or something in the physical labor force because you're not going to get into the white collar positions. You're not going to become a salary man because everyone thinks that if you don't get a job there, something must be wrong with you. And so you have a whole generation of about 10 years after that because the recession hit so bad, no one was hiring. of just people that felt unappreciated, unloved, and never had the opportunity to have the finances to, in their mind, have a family, to be able to um, support a family. And that's continued in some sense, but it's been adopted as at a, ooh, what's the right word I'm looking for? It's been changed a little bit to where now it's both sides of the spectrum. So even if both partners are working, they still feel like they don't have enough because all the jobs are in Tokyo. Tokyo is extremely expensive. And so to be able to have that income, you need to both have a job, but then no one's able to take care of the kids. But then you also lose all the little bit of free time that you have after work to taking care of the kids. So you really have nothing for yourself. And it's this cycle that repeats. So even though now, I think it's been in the early 2000s, I think I might be wrong on this, but either the early 2000s or the early 2010s, the government has offered tax incentives for people to have kids at the equivalent of $300 per kid. And people are not taking advantage of it because they just think it's a burden at the moment because they don't have the finances to begin with, or they just don't want kids, or they can't find a partner because they're too socially scared because the culture is so demanding of them. To go back a little bit to kind of show how demanding it is, there's recently a lot of controversy in the anime industry regarding a production studio. I believe it was MAPPA, MAPPA, because they're known for this problem where they're listed as a black company that is one of those companies that will overwork their employees and be very proud of it. So they'll put out high quality stuff for very low cost because they've won the bid and they bid the lowest. Well, there's the second season of Jujutsu Kaisen was one of those ones that they won and they produced, but they put such a demand on their employees that
Mhm.
the shows that would be aired were being finished an hour before it was to be aired. And so there's no time for anything. And it became very aware that that was meaning that people were staying overnight, they were working overnight. And that's one of those companies that people should not go work for. They're listed with the Japanese government as a black company, but people still want to go work for them because of the prestige that it will give them.
Mhm.
And the workers refused to complain, one, because they had to sign NDAs, but then also because it's part of the honor culture of, oh, look at how much I can suffer for the company and how great that makes me. I didn't finish the anime, but there's another one, Zom 100, where it's a salaryman. He embraces the apocalypse because of the work culture that he got sucked into. It's like the first episode really goes into that, where it is you see people just drowning in energy drinks, and he just hates his job. And so he embraces the zombie apocalypse. It's
Yikes.
also why yeah, it's also why a lot of they're becoming a lot less now, which is encouraging. But a lot of the TV shows, and that includes anime too, would take place in high school because that was the last time they felt like they had freedom and they could enjoy life. And that's a
Mm.
very dangerous thought process to have when you really think about it. And it's all
That's
because the
healthier
culture
than
tells
what
them.
assumption that I brought into it, which is that all of the male audience enjoys high school age teenage girls, and that I'm sure
Oh, that's
maybe
a
that's part
whole
of it
other
too. But
story.
that's as you're talking about the culture in Japan, there's so much overlap. Not just this last one with older guys enjoying looking at younger girls. That's a real problem in America. But when you're talking about young adults that refuse to start a life together because they feel like they just don't have enough. Whether it's getting married in the first place, I can't afford a spouse, or even if we're a husband and wife both working, we can't afford to have kids, we can't afford to have a house. There's definitely a feeling about that in America that is bearing a statistical mark, and you also have a feeling. Apparently, that's supposedly what this Apple TV show Severance is about, but it's talking about cubicle culture and just people giving themselves entirely to their jobs. We definitely have workaholics and people who take pride in how much They pour themselves out for these companies that have no loyalty to them. One of the differences between Japan and America, as I understood it, was that the business culture in Japan was marked, maybe it's not today, was marked by more of a feeling of loyalty, not just of employees towards their employers, but also companies. If you got hired on by a company, it was a safe
Very true.
assumption that they would hold on to you all your life. And that wasn't ever as much the case in America, although there has been such a thing as a company man, and some companies have been more loyal to their employees than others. It just feels like it's a difference of degree or extremity. So much of what you're talking about in Japan, you could say there's clear corollaries in America, but there's also some extremeness. I'm wondering, is feminism as extreme in Japan as it has been in America?
No, I would argue though that they might need some of it though, because there still is some very toxic views regarding women too. Women are sure they can have equal say, they can be bosses, but for example, at the drinking parties, women are the ones that will pour the drinks. It's not an equal thing.
Mhm.
They will always be the ones that are subservient. Yeah, what were some of the other examples I've seen? But it's very much they will the Japanese culture still does have, I wouldn't say it's a very strong sexist view, but there is a view that women have their place just as men, but it's not, oh, it's hard to explain where it's one of those ones you have to see it to really understand it. Maybe sexist might not be the exact word choice, but you can tell that there is a difference, that it's not a healthy difference. It's not equal, but it looks equal. And I
Mm.
really do think that there's some spiritual warfare going on there, because you do see, even among the church here in Japan, it's almost predominantly women. But they still want men to be in charge, but there's almost no men to begin with. And so you really have this counterbalance taking place. And so it's a very interesting perspective of there's a need and there is change that's needed, but no one wants to make the change because it goes against the culture, but they also know that the culture needs to change. If that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, it sort of does. I mean, but that's just another way that America sounds just like Japan. You know, there's the culture you inherit, and it's so hard. I mean, it's so funny because when you read your Bible, it's just so clearly a countercultural document that's supposed to make you a
Hmm.
countercultural or peculiar people. But then you put someone in the position to actually push back against the culture, and they go, "No, no, no, that's a culture here." And you're like, "Yeah, I know. that's kind of that's kind of the direction we've been headed this whole time. What did you think we were doing?" You know?
Right, exactly. There is, it really is one of those ones of one, we can always see a little bit of the Lord in each culture because he is always moving. He's always wanting to um, implement himself further onto us. But at the same time, too, we are so rebellious. And then when you think, I truly believe that the devil is a master of psychology, and it's not that he attacks us, but he'll attack the culture and he'll make himself as less known as possible. And so we need the Holy Spirit to guide us through that. And when you look at the Japanese culture, it looks like it should be they should make the perfect Christians. They have such a hardworking culture. They love people. They're very communal. I used to, just as an exaggeration to make a point, I would say if communism was to work anywhere, it would be Japan. But just to make, it's just an exaggeration to make the point of like they are so communal that even bosses have a lower salary than in America. The idea of a median wage here is pretty even. Even lower class people have have a higher income here. I think that's the word I'm looking for, median. The range in income is a lot smaller here than in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think, oh, there's so much community here. There's so much desire to serve others and truly serve others, that they'd make the perfect Christians, but it's actually one of the things that keeps them away from Christianity, because that immediately makes them an outlier. It makes them different. And so they immediately get ostracized. It's not physical persecution, but there's some serious familia and social pressure not to conform, or not to become Christian, sorry.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, as you say that, I'm going, okay, well, they must have more hours in their day then because they're workaholics and they're on their computers and video games all the time. But then you're saying that they're also super communal. And I'm wondering how that works. Are there still a lot of like public festivals and high social capital and investment in voluntary organizations and stuff?
Yes. And so, if I remember, the best way to describe it would be for the men that have a salary position, so salary men, you're working from 8 to 6, and then you're going to the drinking parties afterwards to celebrate the work that you've done. And that will end around 10 to 11 p.m. And then you're going home and repeating all over again. And for wives that have kids, well, it's like you're with the kids all day, you get the kids to bed, and you go to bed. And that's it. You barely see your husband. And for the more of the blue collar, which is some of the area I'm in, it's similar, but there is that demand to work even when you're not getting paid extra, because overtime is still one of those things that is a struggle to do and or to do correctly and get paid for, because the company's like, well, you work here, you are a part of this family, to use the common, you always hear of coffee shops in America, oh, we're a family, and that's normally the most toxic thing you could hear at
Mm.
a coffee shop in America, and it's that way in Japan. Now again, companies are doing better, but a lot of it's because they have to, because now the global stage is there, so they have to look good. But it's still, there is that culture of, for example, the government mandates now you cannot work a worker over 40 hours, but many of the workers will volunteer their time
Hmm.
because that's their family.
The
That's
cutoff
their
is really
idol.
40?
It's 40 for regular salary. And many people will stay on later because their boss needs them or the company needs them, and they won't take pay, or they'll refuse to take pay if they're required to take the overtime.
I
And
think
so it's
that'd
a
probably
very
be pretty
interesting
common
mix.
here in America as well. 40 seems like a really low number. I'm very surprised that the Japanese government set that. I mean, I would have assumed
Well,
like if they
they see
set a
the
maximum.
problem.
Okay, that's
They
interesting.
the government, it's really funny. The government sees the problem. The
Mhm.
government's trying to address it with, for example, you have the three crises I like to use as an example. You've named one with the economic crisis, you have the aging crisis, and the birthing crisis. The government is working hard to do each one, but the culture's like, nah, I don't want to do that. And so
It's
you have
weird
this cycle continuing.
also learning about China, where they had the one child policy because they were worried about too much. And now they're looking at population collapse as well. And they similarly cannot incentivize people to have babies. And that's same thing in Europe, same thing in America.
Hmm.
And the only, well, there you try and create financial incentives. I don't know why they thought $300 would be a motivator. That is not a motivator. You try 10
It
times
is in
that and maybe.
Japan. So
Really?
Japan's salary is far lower than America. I think the average is about 40. It's so, for example, in my region, my salary is based on the median income because you don't want your missionary to be too poor or too rich.
Yeah.
And so we take the median, and I'm roughly 24,000 a year. And
Okay.
so obviously Tokyo, the outliers are going to be different because they're
Mm.
major cities, but the average is still fairly low. So $300 might be a quarter of the income for a month for a lot of people, if my math is right. If
But
I'm
you're
ever good at
talking about
math, and
that
then
being
1
for a
a.m.
full year, right?
Right. So I
Yeah.
mean, you're right. You're right as well. But it's also a lot for the government to be willing to do that too. And they also do take care of a lot of the incentives for children too. So your hospital stay, the best place to be if you're going to give birth is Japan. It's free. You go into the hospital, you're there for a couple of days, they'll provide all the food, they'll provide everything, they'll take care of the baby, all of it, and
Mm.
it's free. And then the incentives for diapers, all this stuff you need for children, it's not free, but it's taxed less, if I remember correctly. Obviously, I'm single, so I don't have kids,
Right.
so I
Yeah.
don't know this.
Yeah.
I'm hearing secondhand from the missionaries that do have kids, but there's a lot of, the 300 was just the first thing of thinking like, okay, long term, this is what they're doing, 300 a year for each kid that you have. And it's because they're trying to incentivize more of them. And but there are still like the regional government in Shunan, no, and Yamaguchi is giving free daycare to all children. And so some of the missionaries are considering that, and okay, how can we use this as a missionary
Oh,
opportunity to reach the
sure.
other
Yeah.
families? But it's like, hey, we're also saving a lot of money here too. So
So it just seems to me, I mean, there is obviously a spiritual sickness going on when people cannot even be cajoled to have children. There's something wrong going on across the world. This is a global trend that has few
right.
exceptions. But also, when you're looking at Japan, one of the things that, I mean, when you saw, do you remember the name of the Scorsese film that I'm talking about that followed the missionaries?
Silence.
Silence. Okay. So in Silence, you see that from the very beginning, Japanese culture, and especially those who are in authority, have been very hostile to Christianity. It has a very subversive message. My understanding is that Shintoism, that is native, tried to work with Christianity, but Christianity doesn't work well with others. Jesus isn't one God among many. He's not a principle. He's a historical man who deserves ultimate fealty, and all the other stuff is lies. And so Christianity is also subversive towards authoritarian government. We defer to a higher authority that's not at all integrated necessarily with. So it makes sense as to why an authoritarian government would not like it, but that's not the picture that you painted in the beginning. In the beginning, you said the people have been gaslit into thinking that they don't need a savior. You said something like that. And so it's interesting that you find this culture that, at least to outside eyes, would say something's obviously wrong here. People probably know it. And yet, whatever the answer is, it can't be Jesus. And then also, it just seems like things are set up to fail if you have a highly communitarian, communal um, culture, and the ones you have on board are women. You know, men are generally
Hmm.
less agreeable than women. They're more likely to push against the grain and be pioneers. But when the people you're getting on board are the ones that go along to get along, um, it seems like you've got a recipe for stagnation. So maybe speak a little
Yes.
bit more about the cultural understanding of what Christianity is about and why it is that it's not a fertile planting ground necessarily.
I was thinking while you're saying that, and I think maybe I would misspoke with gaslit, and maybe it's a combination of gaslit, but also Stockholm syndrome in a sense,
Okay.
where it's very much that they believe that the government and their job are the saviors, but at the same time, they don't want to do exactly everything that the government says, and that's when they rely on their company or their family too. Very good friend of mine wrote his master's thesis regarding the cultural barriers of Christianity in Japan, and one of the things that he said was that the Japanese religion looks like Shintoism and looks like Buddhism, but it's actually the family ancestor worship. So the worship of the ancestors. They don't know why they do it, but they still will worship them. And I've even heard stories recently within the last 4 or 5 months of people saying, I believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that he is who he say he is, but I refuse to accept him because I cannot leave my family. And so there really is this very interesting dynamic of logic doesn't come to play a lot of the time in these cases. And so I think as we try to think logically, we kind of have to stop a little bit with that and think, okay, what's the emotional ties that are happening here? Because even the men, I would argue, show a different level of masculinity than the West. I think the men, I watched an interesting video on YouTube today because I love video essays
Mhm.
where the author was making the argument that Samwise Gamgee was the idea of masculinity by serving. And it's so beautifully done. And I would say that that is the Japanese perspective of the man that is the most masculine is the one serving. For example, not having a beard for Japan is very good. That's the handsome thing to do. If you have a beard, you look like a wild man. It's not very seen as very attractive. And so it's very different from the West. So being big and muscular, it's still frowned upon in Japan in a sense. It's changing, but that skinny long distance runner, that's the idea of attraction. And when you think of, well, what does someone want to do with their free time? A lot of it is either I'm staying at home and doing nothing because I'm utterly exhausted, or, well, I have to give my time back to the company. The company's doing this cleanup event at the beach. I'm going to go do that. And so it's either this hyper extreme of isolation or this hyper extreme of being in the community. And it very much is to bring Christ into that. You have to find, how do you show Christ into this culture that doesn't realize it's in a crisis and doesn't realize it needs a savior, but at the same time you see so much hurt and pain, and they know that they have that hurt and pain, but they think it's normal. And so I truly do think that it's going to take the collapse that will happen for people to realize our culture is not what we need, and change will need to happen.
Have you seen FX's Shogun?
I have not. I really need to, but it's hard to get here. The international trade laws or whatever it is for television, it makes things so interesting trying to watch stuff.
Sure. I'd be interested in how native Japanese see their culture depicted towards the West. And for anyone who is interested, now I was going to recommend Vinland Saga. I would just say briefly, Vinland Saga is a beautiful saga. It's based on real Viking history. It's one culture telling
Hmm.
another culture's history that is foreign to America. So as an American watching it, you're seeing a cultural reflection and an homage really to Viking culture. It's beautiful. But in the Shogun series, the depiction of Japanese masculinity is, I mean, it's still very much concerned with honor and family, but it also seems to have had more room for men to be strong and wild and extreme in various ways that are not necessarily good for. It, I'm wondering how much of the current masculine Japanese male mentality is whenever things did get centralized under a common government, and everybody was finally a part of the same thing rather than having inter-clan warfare. But then how much World War II, it seems to me that Japanese men in World War II, I mean, you hear about Japanese men who refused to believe that the emperor gave in and they'd be stationed on different islands and still continuing in
Yep.
warfare for a decade or 2 decades until like they had to anyway, these, I mean, what resolve, what commitment
Hmm.
from these men, and it's not this go along to get along thing. It's I will fight and die even if it means suffering the rest of my life. And that's exactly, I mean, I see that as so virtuous, even if it's misled. And the picture you're giving me is they'll sacrifice, and maybe sacrifice is a form of fighting, but it's not the same masculine fighting that we envision in the West. And I find myself being bemused. You know, here in the West, what Christianity helps us understand is life is not so as individualistic as we like to think. You know, that we do have to have a common concern for the social fabric. We do have to put others before ourselves. But it sounds like the role of the church in Japan is the opposite, where they're too communal minded and you're needing to actually teach people, look, you're going to have to answer for yourself. You're not saved by your family. You're not saved by your company. It's between you and Jesus. And when you're saying you can't come to Jesus because of your family, we have this in America, of course, as well. You're making your family an idol. You're worshiping your family. You're not worshiping the
That's
Lord. And
exactly it. Yep, that's a very accurate way of putting it, and it's very much to add a little bit of context here too. When I've talked to some of the Japanese Christians with what little Japanese I can use, or when I've had help with the translator, there is the meekness of Jesus is on full display. His servant's heart, his willingness to be that servant is the thing that the Japanese Christians rally behind
mm,
from what I've seen and noticed. But at the same time, too, they will look to the pastor to do everything. So, for example, the church I currently go to, as we prepare to um, church plant here in my city, I go to a church in Yanai on the other side of the prefecture with a Japanese pastor, and the church, amazing church, but you can see that they still look to the pastor to do everything, and he's in his 70s, close to his 80s now, and it's because that's the view they have of he's the one that will go out, he's the one that will do it because one, he's the man, and then two, they still have this kind of country club kind of view of it, where it's our community. We don't want our community destroyed by bringing in others that might harm the unity. or the harmony, and we like who we are as
Mm.
is. And so there is that difficult balance. And that's why I would say when it comes to the church, the stats I have are written in 2016, and so I know it's far worse now. And I hate to say that, but when it comes to the church, I think it's 75% is over the age of 65. And that puts a very strong perspective. And when you think of pastors, I think now 80% of pastors are over the age of 60. And what is that? So 90, no, not 90. Sorry, I got it backwards. 90% are over the age of 60 and 80% are over the age of 70.
Mm.
And you can really see it became a country club kind of thing because there has been no growth for so long. Well, why is there no growth if it grew so much during that time? Well, no one's going out.
So
Things are
tell
not
us that
happening.
history.
So
Tell
why is
me the
that?
history of the growth of Christianity in Japan.
The part I know is after World War II, it was MacArthur, General MacArthur had requested 10,000 missionaries and less than 1,000 went, most of them Roman Catholic. And we see this stagnation taking place after the initial um, push. But there was also obviously Christians there beforehand, but because of the nationalism of Japan and the way that the government chose not to persecute, but also enforce them to follow the laws. There was times similar to the movie Silence, where they said, "Okay, you'll be saved if you step on the this picture of Jesus and Mary." Well, there were similar things that were happening after the reintroduction of globalism in the late 1860s, where imperialism started to rise again in Japan, and the government said, you can worship Jesus as long as you worship the emperor as well, since the emperor was the figurehead of the military. And so you saw that rise again. And so now you have a very strong mixed bag of heresies because Japan's known as the land of the cults because everyone's looking for a way to satisfy this unsatisfaction that they have. And so you have a lot of heresies that have developed, and you also have a rise. I don't think it's a big rise, but I've noticed them enough to say, okay, that's a problem of Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses being relevant here as well. And having a say too, where today I was playing soccer with a bunch of guys and one of them asked, oh, you're a missionary? So Jehovah's Witness? And I was like, no, 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 I'm a Protestant. And they knew immediately, oh, okay, okay, okay. And so it really is one of those things of there's a lot of barriers at this point because of all the other issues happening. And I know that's not a little bit about the history. I was a little all over the
No, no,
place,
no.
but
That's
that's
it's
as
all interesting to me. And in my head, I'm just a problem solver. So in my head, I'm just going, okay, how do you reach a culture like this? What methods are effective at getting people out of this very, I mean, as you describe it, it seems very messy in some ways and then very structured in a hostile way
mhm.
in some ways. So are you familiar? What kind of success stories in Japan motivate you as you dream about God blessing your ministry there?
Oh. Some of the recent ones I've heard is let's see, so last April we had four men come to know the Lord, and our team leader had been here 15 years, and that was the first time that they've seen that many men in the normal would be one every couple of years. And the fact that we saw four within 4 months, that's a beautiful story. The Lord is working. One of those men had a dream and came to the church asking about the dream, and he came to faith through that. And some others were, I believe one, he wanted to date and marry one of the Japanese ladies, and she said, no, you have to come to church, all these things. And so it was an element of missionary dating, but it was very much he came to his own fruition. He really cared for her and wanted to know. And so a lot of it is these small victories, and a lot of it is coming from those that have served a long time in Japan. So, let's see, my team leader just recently had a conversation with a guy who wants to accept Jesus and is walking through that mental process with his son because his son had questions as well. as well as with our team leader. And my team leader had been here, let's see, I think 5 to 6 years, if I include Tokyo, when he served in Tokyo with another agency. And so that was one of the first ones he's seen. So it's a long process, and patience is needed as they process through what they think is such a foreign um, Western religion, but in reality, how much Jesus really speaks to them. And as much as they don't go out and make disciples, they're some of the most committed to going deep into the word and going deep into knowing and willing to go that extra step for it.
In America, whenever we try and make disciples, if we even do, a lot of churches just throw open the doors, let people come to worship, trust that they're going to work things out with them and Jesus. But um, there are different models. Sometimes there's an intentional walking through the Romans road and showing people their own depravity and their need of a savior, and then giving them an
Hmm.
opportunity to have a prayer where they mark a change in their life, and then of course baptism, the initiation into the church. Does it look significantly different in any ways in Japan whenever you're trying to make disciples there?
I would say the big difference is we have to start from the beginning, that there is a God and he created the earth. And from there, it's okay, now where do we walk to? So there's a few different resources, but it very much is that once they become disciples. And obviously, when we're evangelizing too, a lot of it starts with Jesus. And I do think that that's going to be the big thing in the next 10 years is starting with the love of Christ as people start to realize that so much is broken in Japan and they face that um, identity crisis or real identity crisis that they haven't experienced yet. And they have to say, well, what truly is love? And so I think those are the two big things of starting at first with what is love and not just the emotional side, but the action. I think I remember mentioning on one of your chats too, like we kind of forget that love is an action and not just a verb. So what makes the love of, serving the poor, which Japan's pretty good at doing, there's not many homeless. But what makes that difference between a Christian and a non-Christian doing it? And then also, well, what's the foundations of the world? How do we know that God is real and the consequences of our actions with God are real too? And so I'd say that those are the two big things that need to be addressed when making disciples first and foremost.
Are there any outfits that motivate with fear rather than love? And how do they do?
Ooh, I would say that that would push people away because the another one of the big things in Japan, because it really is, it's either this one or two extremes of everything or nothing. And with Japan, harmony is also everything. The buses, the buses, the trains, everything is so quiet. You do not disturb the peace because you don't want to disturb others. And so fear is not the best tactic. And I do think that there's a way to approach it where you can talk about things that we normally would be fearful in our eyes, but loving in others. So instead of saying, someone's going to hell, you'd be like, I really care about you and I really don't want to see you be absent from the Lord and knowing what true love truly is.
Well, okay,
And so,
let me just think thought experiment. You're talking to a Japanese man and you say, "You pour yourself out for your employer. You're an amazing company man. You give all your time, your energy to your company. But listen, when you die, they're not going to talk about you. They're just going to get another employee. And in the meantime, you have a father in heaven who actually deserves a lot of what you're giving to your employer. And he's rightfully angry at you because you're giving other people what he deserves. And if you get to the end of this life and you have nothing to show for him for what he was due and what you chose not to give, you are not going to be acknowledged as a good company man by that Lord, and he will turn you away." I would think that
ooh,
that would play on a lot of this loyalty that they have in their culture and provide, like, here, I thought I was being a good worker, and actually I've been neglecting my primary boss. Do you think that that would not go well with a Japanese minded person?
I'd be interested to see because I haven't thought about that perspective and I'm not sure I've seen that perspective being shown. But I'm curious regarding discipleship, how that would go.
Hmm.
Because my first thought is, for example, recently among college students, one thing I've tried doing is presenting the prodigal son.
Hmm.
And every Japanese person identifies with the older brother.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, well, now I got to start thinking, okay, how do I approach it differently too, where to show that the older brother has also sinned in this position as well. And so I think there might be some success with that in the sense of at least getting people thinking,
Hmm.
because I think the immediate thought or the immediate pushback that would be given would be, well, I have to think about the here and now more so than later on. And that's the interesting dynamic of like, well, why? Like,
That's so
you're already
stupid.
saved so much money. Exactly. You're already saving money because they're a saving society.
Right. Yeah.
They have to encourage you to take loans for a business by giving you money.
If there was ever a
And
culture that delays gratification, has there ever
oh,
been a culture that
absolutely.
delays gratification more than the one you're ministering? And you would think that if any culture would understand thinking eternally or thinking about the future, it would be the Japanese. How weird.
And I think it's one of those ones where you see culture and religion clashing, where they would say that they're not religious, but they're spiritual, but it's more of a cultural thing because they don't actually believe that everything has a God to it, but they'll still go through all the rituals because their culture does it. But I don't think many of them actually believe in an afterlife in any sense at all. I think the Japanese I know that are honest with me and showing their true face to me do say that they don't believe that there is a God at all. And I think that the true reality is that most Japanese are atheist and they culturally say that they're Shinto or Buddhist because that's what you do when you're Japanese.
Kamino, right?
And so it's uh Shinto and Buddhist and then Kamino. Yeah, the kami, so the gods. Yep.
Okay.
So the gods would be with Shinto, so kami.
I'm just it's so strange so many of these stories that I've watched from the Japanese culture expressed by Japanese people is concerned with ultimate meaning. And I only know that word because I've seen them talk about God so much in Japanese stories. So it's just so, in American culture, of course, we have a huge swelling number of people who say that they're atheists and they don't believe this stuff, but they still believe there's a purpose to life. They believe in right and wrong. They believe that these feelings of love and hate and shame and desire all have significance. And so it seems to me, at least in the West, that those are starting points for pointing towards not just a creator, but a sustainer and redeemer that knows you and can be known. But it's very difficult connecting something in people's heads that has, it seems, been intentionally broken, if not by the state, then by Satan. It's ever since I learned about you and where you're in ministry, it's just I've gone, man, what an uphill battle. If there's a people group that's more ingrained than Americans, oh my gosh, Japan. Let's talk basically about, we've talked about your context, but we haven't talked about how you're rooted there. You've obviously had experience with Wesleyan Methodists, but also you're
Hmm.
not serving in the Global Methodist Church. We only barely have a missions agency. I'm not familiar with a single missionary. So you've been at this long before the GMC even got established. You've been feeling called to be a missionary. Christar is the group that hosts your funding. Are they a missionary agency or are you under another agency?
They are a missionary agency, so they are based out of Dallas, Texas, and they're interdenominational.
Okay.
They originally were the Inner India. Yeah, let's see. So they ministered originally to the Buddhist, Hindus, and Muslims. So Inner India, Inner Iran, and the South China Sea. And that's where it originally started. And the three came together to form what is now Christar. And so they focus mainly on Asia, where it is the largest unreached area of the world. So, yeah.
They have a big presence in China?
I'm trying to think of what I can say and what I shouldn't say. I think I
Okay.
can say we do have people there, and I think that's probably the safest thing I can say just in
Okay.
case,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
China's everywhere. So,
I guess that was kind of a foolish question because I am aware that it's a hostile situation, but it's also a place where Christianity seems to be doing quite well despite great state interference.
well,
So you're
on a, s-
you're go ahead.
on a side note too, this is something we as a team have been discussing too, of just trying to understand the whole situation. There's an interesting perspective of when you look at Japan and China and a little extent Korea, the places that the church is growing are those that have suffered a lot. And Japan really hasn't suffered much at all, to be honest. When you look at China, it's been suffering for millennia. When you look at Korea, stuck between two big powerhouses, they've been suffering a lot as well. And so you really see, and I think there is something to that where complacency is the biggest hindrance to the church,
Mm,
wherever it is. And I think in the future we'll see that happening within Africa and South America too, where once they start to become more of a first world countries, I think it's good because the Lord has given us great things and he doesn't want us to live in squalor, but at the same time we need to be reminded, and I think we, as the Jews did walking through the desert, we got to be reminded of what we've been given and be satisfied with that as well because it comes from the Lord. But once we can start producing our own, and then that becomes a little bit of a problem in a sense too.
but
Not
when
to
you were
over
talking about the
exaggerate the matter.
psyche of the Japanese people you're speaking to, you explicitly were saying that they carry so much pain. And I think there is an existential pain that takes place in developed nations and affluent areas where people don't have an excuse for pain and trauma, and yet there it is. And it seems to me that one of the unique challenges of our context that's only going to get worse is in the midst of great material affluence, the
Hmm.
ambivalence that comes when Christ is still the only savior you got and you need him as much as you ever did, but it's easier to ignore that than it's ever been. So it seems to
Yes.
me that you're actually on the pioneering on the forefront of how is it Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but society is changing. So how is it that we make authentic disciples in the same line as the saints that go back to the day of Pentecost? And yet we're going to have to draw these connections differently than in an undeveloped part of the world. And I'm not sure that anyone is doing a particularly good job at that, at least in America. We've got consumerism and market forces that we play off of here, but when we're talking
Hmm.
about any kind of statistically significant method of making disciples that would die for their faith, that are countercultural, that um, don't have any other idols, but establish Christ as Lord in their lives and live and die and breathe for Him. Um, it's easy to see that in developing part of the world, suffering, persecuted part of the world. It's very hard to find many like that, not just in the West, but in Japan. And I wonder at South Korea. I know that the church is healthier there, but they seem to be pretty. I don't know. That's a whole other thing. You talked about the nature of your mission work there. Would I be right in understanding you're not a parachute drop, you're not a solo operation, but you're nestled within a group of people that are ministering
Hmm.
there?
Yes,
So
sir.
tell us
So
about
we
that.
have our so we have our focus group, which is the entire group of 13 of us now. And then we have two teams. We have our central team and discovery team. The names don't really, um, it just helps us distinguish. And the central team is more traditional church planting, going door to door, making connections, inviting people. And the discovery team, the one I'm a part of, we're looking at more house church, small group, local discipleship communities as well, and really walking through um, the Bible in a small group setting.
Mm,
And so those are the two big differences our teams are doing, and both do have the benefits and negatives too. And so it really is like, hey, let's just try something new because we do see the issues that are present, and it's like, well, how do we address them? Because we've only started talking about the cultural issues. We're not even really kind of talking about the issues within the church of the Japanese people learning what does it mean to be a Christian and how does that look as well. And so, and I don't want to make it all sound super negative because there is still beauty in what we're seeing too.
of
And I
course.
do think that when their revival does happen in Japan, it's going to be one of the biggest in the world. And I think it'll be one of the most impactful when we really see how the Japanese people love the Lord with all their heart, mind, body, and soul and love their neighbor as theirself. The day I look forward to the most is when, even though it'll be coming from the government, I think it'll be a reflection of the people when the government acknowledges the rape of Nanking. And I think that that'll be a very powerful statement of we did this in a society where honor is everything, that they don't acknowledge the things they've done wrong in the past. So, anyways, going back to the team, we
Well, let me
do
explain
see
to the
that there's
audience just
different
real quick. The
methods.
rape of Nanking was something that the Japanese army did. Nanking was a city in China. The Japanese invaded um, Manchukuo, I think, was the region that they had where they were trying to become an imperial power in the east, and these troops went in and did the most horrible things that you can imagine to men, women, and children in that city for a prolonged period of time. It's been well documented historically. It's one of the best evidences for the doctrine of absolute depravity. And if you ever want to know what humans are, whenever you put them in a position of absolute power with no accountability. That's one of the historical instances you can look at. So the Japanese government has been reluctant or unwilling to acknowledge that they facilitated such a thing. But it seems to you an inevitability that they will come around to that repentance.
I do think so, and this is my own personal thought, so I'll be very cautious in saying that. Where I do think that once the culture identity crisis takes place, the Japanese will start to come to know the Lord as I truly think that that's the largest barrier because it is when you have a culture that is designed to not let people out and it comes crashing down, people will want to know. And as Japan has to import more workers, those barriers will come down even quicker because you're having so much culture shock take place of, oh, they don't understand our rules. We need to enforce our rules, but we also have to give them grace. Oh, there's so many of them. We can't do anything about it now. What do we do? Our whole life is being ruined and uprooted, and our comforts are being taken away from us.
Mm.
And so it really is an interesting perspective of, well, what's going to happen next? And I truly think that the Lord is using this as an opportunity to prepare people. Now, I do think that rural Japan is where that's going to take place, where when the economic crisis happens, people are going to have to leave the big cities. And I do think, should be ready for that wave of people coming to the smaller cities where it's more affordable. And what amazing opportunity would it be if we already have those little spots established where that we can
Mm.
be an example of Christ and see how the church or how the culture is changing to worship and honor the Lord. And then these people are coming in with their whole lives shaken up because they've had to move out of what they've called home and what was the place where they could make money now to these smaller areas. And how would it look for the community to already be ready to accept them and love them and help
Mhm.
them in this situation?
This is what ministry looks like. You're you're a missionary who's gone from one culture to another, but this is kind of how the mind. This is a great depiction of what the mind of a pastor looks like because you sit and imagine all the various ways in which the Lord can save people. And you position yourself and your community very intentionally for that. And you pray for that and you yearn for that. And this is what love looks like. A lot of people would listen to our conversation and be like, man, these guys don't like the Japanese very much. They're saying a lot of bad things. But the thing is, when you love somebody, you love them warts and all, and you acknowledge where they are. And then you also dream about where the Lord is calling them to be. That's how marriage works. That's how raising your kids
Mhm.
works. That's what authentic love looks like. And so you've chosen to love the Japanese at this point in your life. Could you speak? We're nearing the end of our time here, but I want you to talk about why it is that you became clear that the Lord expected you, was calling you to become a missionary. And then I think there are probably a number of people that might watch this and they need to probably ask that question too about if the Lord is expecting them, calling them to do this. And so start with you and then move towards the audience, if you would.
Oh, oh man, I'm trying to figure out how to keep this long story short too. And Even from my chats, you can tell I'm a long-winded speaker. So I think one of the biggest things for me, and it's my favorite verse, is Revelation 7, 9, and 10, where all tongues, tribes, nations will be worshiping him in his throne room, singing, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. And how beautiful that is, and how encouraging that is, too, when we think that everyone is going to be represented there. And that was one of the most impactful things that I read in 2012. And it really started pushing me because during that time, too, if I remember correctly, we were having an immigration crisis as well. And I was going through, um, I wouldn't call it a deconstruction, but a reconstruction of faith and understanding, well, if we have illegal immigrants here, let's serve them anyways because they're going to be here anyways. And I was having some pushback with friends and everything about it. And there's some valid points for like we have to protect ourselves too. And during that time, we get with one of my friends, he got heated and he said, well, why don't you go there and help them anyways? And I said, fine, I will. So that's where the journey basically began.
Oh, wow.
And
That's fun.
yeah, I love it. And it's ironic now because that he's one of my best friends. And
Yeah.
ironically, he is in the military and he's serving in this part of the world now too, to be cautious with where he's at. And so it's really funny too, because I was telling him like, what's the irony of this whole thing happening?
Wow. It's not always a bad thing to do something out of, I'll prove it to you. Or, I mean, it's like,
Hmm.
we on the right, I'll put I'm not saying you're on the right, but I'm on the right, and a lot of times people on the right will accuse people on the left of virtue signaling and saying something that they won't really put themselves behind. So, like with the immigration stuff, well, how about you welcome them into your home, and then we'll see how much you really believe this stuff. But essentially, what
Right.
you've done is that you've not only your thing wasn't bringing them into our homes. Your thing was ministering to these people and really trying to escort other cultures into the throne room of God. And so he said, "Why
Hmm.
don't you just do it then?" And you said, "All right." And then here you are, proving your buddy
Ex
wrong and showing that you have the strength of your convictions. And now you totally regret it, right?
Not at all. As I matured, and one of the most helpful and one of the most dangerous things I think people can do, and I think there's different versions of this, but one thing I'd always pray is for the Lord to break my heart for what breaks his.
Mm,
And that's definitely led to bouts of depression because he will put that on your heart. And it really was the moving for his people. And so that was one of the things that I was going through as I continued to try to understand and reconstruct and understand what that meant. That was one of the prayers I prayed, and it really started to move me over the next, let's see, so I transferred in 2016, officially to start pursuing a degree in understanding what it meant to be a missionary. That would have been during those 4 years. That was one of the things I prayed the most for. And that really changed my heart and humbled my heart to be like, oh, this is not about me going and doing this. And I think a lot of the time we desire to be one of the 12. And I think it's good to desire to be like them or even Paul, but most of the time we're going to be like the end of Romans 16, where you have the list of people and we forget how much of an impact those people played in sharing the message and sending it out and even building the churches before Paul arrived. And I think most of the time that's us, and we forget that. And having that humble attitude of, I just want to serve the Lord, similar to how Wes Huff has been acting after his appearances on Joe Rogan and Patrick Bet David and all these others, where it's like, I, it's not about me. I don't
mm,
care. I'm just the vessel that the Lord is using at these times.
mhm.
And I think that's a really good, even though we have our own free will and choice making, that desire, and I think this actually amplifies it, that since we have that choice, what better way to use that free will than to serve the Lord fully?
Mhm.
And I think it's one of those things that was one of the most impactful things for me is like, if I want to truly love the Lord with all my heart, mind, body, and soul, I do think personally that this is what he's calling me to.
Yeah.
And he hasn't taken me away from it. And I do think when the Lord closes a door, it's not just, oh, I'm telling you no right now. It's a um, long story short, the founder for Columbia International Missions, his son wanted to be a missionary in Japan as well back in the 50s. As him and his wife were getting ready to board the boat to go over, they prayed one last time to the Lord, hey Lord, if this is truly what you want us to do, help us along. If this is not, please close that door. the boat engine broke and they could not go. And I was like, well, if you want an ever more clear sign,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
to use like as an example, but like if you're going to pray that and you're honestly seeking the Lord to answer that prayer, what a better way to make it known where he's going to make it impossible for you to do it. And if he's not making it impossible for you to do it, then maybe you should consider it.
So, what kind of prayer? I'm imagining somebody watching this and going, well, it sounds miserable, but I'm also very drawn to this. And I think I might need to love somebody the way that this Stephen guy is choosing to love this other culture. What kind of prayer should they be saying?
This just came to mind. The first thing I would say is pray that the Lord turns emotional love inside you into actionable love outside of you.
Okay. Okay. Um, I had a funny. I'm not going to turn this funny. I want to thank you personally for uh, being such a regular contributor and bringing the quality of the comments up on my work. And I hope that continues after I uh, say goodbye to you here today. But even if it doesn't, I want to be a blessing to you. And so I want to promote one more time, everybody going over. This should be in the show notes. This is at chrisstar.org. And then your worker number 738, it looks like. And so people can go and support
Yes, sir.
your mission work there. If somebody wants to correspond with you, encourage you, throw their granddaughter at you, where can they get a hold of you at?
I think the easiest thing right now is either my social media, which is just my full name. You can find me on Instagram or Facebook. I don't
Mhm,
check Facebook too often because of just how political it's gotten and got to be safe there too.
mhm.
Don't want to upset the wrong people. Um, as well as steven.bachmeier@gmail.com. My email
Okay.
is probably the best thing to where I can easily correspond. And if you do email me as well, I can add you to my email list. I do video prayer letters weekly, and so I find that pretty encouraging for people, and it allows
Yeah.
for people to pray daily because it's like, oh, I'm remembering him weekly, not just once a month.
Oh,
So
that's great. I didn't know about that. Okay. Well, I'll probably send you an email and say, put me on the list. So,
sounds
how about
good.
we close with you praying for whoever spent their time with us?
Lord, thank you so much for the people that do have a deep heart and conviction for you, those that seek out channels like Plain Spoken and others to further understand what's happening in their own denominations, and other parts of the world, Lord. I pray that
Mm,
those people watching right now continue to grow a heart for your people, Lord, when they do see suffering or realize the state of it, just like how I've been so unaware of what's happening in Africa, that you make us aware and allow us these opportunities to pray for them, to beseech on their behalf, to go to you and asking for you to move, Lord. And I thank you that you do move even before our prayers, Lord. You're always acting. You're always moving. You're always loving, Lord. Lord, I pray each and every one of us continues to seek out to love you with all our heart, mind, body, and soul.
mm,
And that may we emulate that with our neighbors as the globe continues to become more globalized, where race is now removed from the definition of culture and everything becomes so topsy-turvy that regardless of all of it, through our own failings, Lord, you continue to work through us. I thank you and I ask you that you continue to do that.
mm.
And above all else, may we never ever fall out of love with you, Lord.
That's right.
May we never outlive love. May you continue to reach out to us, motivate us, continue to not just pursue us, Lord, but help us learn to love you and above all else to revere you. I think here in America, we tend to overemphasize your fathership and forget your kingship. So I do pray
Mm,
that we also revere you fully, Lord.
mm,
Lord, I pray for each and every person watching this that they do feel and do get something out of this, not just the negative of like, oh, how dark is Japan, but that they're reminded, just as we knew that you would come 3 days later, Lord, that Japan will come to know you.
mm,
And those that would feel called to come here, Lord, that they do pray deeply about it and don't feel that fear of going or this unknown culture that's so backwards, Lord, but that they can see the love that these people have for each other
Mhm.
and how beautiful it can be when it's put in its right place. But also that they can love these people as well, Lord. As your love is so much sweeter than anything else in the world, Lord.
Yes.
Your love is the most important thing. And you've shown that through your action, Lord, with Jesus. And I pray that so many people get to hear about you, about Jesus, and what you have done for us, Lord. And I pray that so many get to hear that through me and through everyone else too, Lord, that's watching this.
Mm.
And even more so, everyone else too, because there's so many more than just me, Lord. And I pray all this in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Amen. Friends, thank you for spending time with me and Stephen. I've obviously been blessed by him, and I hope you have been at this point too. Stephen's not the first person outside of the continental U.S. that I've spoken with. In fact, I've spoken with a lot of people, and my hope is that as I continue to grow this platform, that you and many others will take an interest in people outside of your native culture. I think it's only by stepping out of our culture that we can learn to see it as it is. Um, One of the exercises that we might engage in here is how many people would come as missionaries to America and say, oh, look how dark it is, and all these ways that it's dark. How many ways have we learned to be ambivalent about the darkness in which we're living? I think we need to see ourselves, the faith, the world with the eyes that mission work makes possible. And so it's my intention, even if it doesn't get a bunch of clicks, to continue to platform voices like Stephen's. And so if you know of other people that I need to speak to, please connect them to me at plainspokenpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because I'm going to be platforming people like this. And if you're of means to be a blessing to them monetarily, I hope you do feel that burden to be that, and that you take joy in doing that. So we're going to conclude our time here. Once more, Stephen, thank you so much for spending your time with me.
Yeah,
All right,
thank
friends.
you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, sir. All right, we'll see y'all later.